Hello all and welcome to another edition of Everyday Black History. Now today on Everyday Black History, we're going to be highlighting a woman by the name of Mary Smith Peake. Now Mary Smith Peake was important because she was an American teacher, a black American teacher, humanitarian, and member of the black elite in Hampton, Virginia, best known for starting a school for the children of former slaves starting in the fall of 1869 under what is now known as the Emancipation Oak. She's also known for being one of the founders of Hampton University, which is one of the oldest and most well-known HBCUs that we have around today. But now, a little background on her. Mary Smith Peake was born Mary Smith Kelsey, and she was born free in Norfolk, Virginia. Now, her father was an Englishman he was considered of rank and culture, and her mother was a free woman of color who would have been described during those times as light-skinned, what we call light-skinned. But when she was 6, she was her mother sent her to live with an aunt in Alexandria, where she attended school and learned how to read and write. Now, she lived with her aunt for about 10 years, and during that time, the U.S. Congress enacted a law prohibiting free people of color, as well as slaves, from learning how to read and write or being educated at all. It was actually illegal in the District of Columbia for a free person of color to be educated. And that was not just in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., it was also in Virginia and several other southern states. And this new law was enacted after the Nat Turner Rebellion, the failed rebellion of 1831. So they wanted to keep, whether you were a slave or free, they wanted to keep black Americans during that time ignorant. But what makes Mary Smith Peake so important was that in 1839, at the age of 16, when she returned to live with her mother, and despite all the risk of breaking the law, she secretly taught slaves and free blacks to read and write. She believed education was important to the race, as is important to any race. And in 1847, when her mother got married and moved the family to Hampton, Virginia, they bought a house. And right after that, in the 1850s, she secretly again began teaching enslaved and free black Americans, and she was one of a number of black women whose teaching was, a few years later, officially sanctioned by the Union Army as the United States entered the Civil War. She also founded a women's charitable organization called the Daughters of Zion, whose mission it was to assist the poor and the sick. And she not only taught, which she did for free, but she supported herself by dressmaking. She was a dressmaker. She had her own business doing that, as well as teaching. Now, her stepfather, Thomas Walker, was one of her adult students, and he became a leader of the blacks in Hampton. He became a well-known figure in the black community, and that was mostly due to him being educated by his stepdaughter. Now, during the American Civil War, slaves who were seeking refuge or seeking asylum, they became known as contraband, and contraband camps were formed, and the term contraband was actually a legal status to prevent escaped slaves from being returned to their Confederate slaveholders. So contraband camps, began to form where all these escaped slaves were seeking asylum and seeking refuge. We'll do another episode later on contraband camps because that's a whole other thing unto itself. But they built the Great Contraband Camp near the outside of Fort Monroe out there in Virginia, and Mary Peake started teaching the children of former slaves in those contraband camps. Now, the American Missionary Association, an organization during that time which helped a lot of black people, slaves, former slaves, escaped slaves, they actually started to pay her a salary and give her support as his first black teacher. And she began teaching outside on September 17, 1861, under a large oak tree, which became later known as the Emancipation Oak, because it was there 2 years later in 1863 that she read the Emancipation Proclamation to her students, stating that, slavery was over, we were being emancipated, and it was a joyous occasion during that time. Now, soon the AMA, the American Missionary Association, provided Mary Smith Peake with a brown cottage, which is considered to be the first facility of the Hampton Institute, which is now known as Hampton University. See, as mentioned, she was one of the founders of Hampton University. Now, both children and adults were eager to learn, and she was there to teach them all. Her school taught more than 50 children during the day and 20 adults at night. Even when Mary Peake was seriously ill, she continued to teach. Unfortunately, on February 22nd, 1862, she died of tuberculosis, which she had contracted before the war. But the historic Emancipation Oak, which was planted in 1831, is still on the campus of Hampton University to this day, and it's actually it's been designated a National Historic Landmark. But we can see if you're in Virginia, whenever you hear about Hampton University, even if you watch the show A Different World, Hillman College is based over Hampton University. We can always think about Mary Smith Peake and her contribution, and her putting herself at risk to teach and educate despite it being illegal. We can always think about her and thank her for her contribution to Black history and even her sacrifice. So Mary Smith Peake, as I say with all who we highlight on Everyday Black History, we thank you for your contribution and we salute you for it. Now that concludes this episode of Everyday Black History. Please tune in, as we'll be having many more people and institutions representing the whole African diaspora that we'll be highlighting. So stay tuned.